Today is the day we start to lay some tile on the floor in this basement. Done all the preparation work, the general layout, floor is clean, ready to go. We've got a few more detailed steps to do to mark some lines where we're going to start the floor on this end so we can work our way back into the area where the door is. Let's get started. Let's do a quick run through of the things you're going to need on hand when you get started on your tile project. You're going to need a container to mix the thinset in. I just use an old drywall mud bucket. And then I have a heavy-duty drill with a mixer attachment on the end that I'll use to mix the thinset. I also have on hand then the tile spacers. You're going to need those. And in this case, again, we're using a 3/16 tile spacer with a 12-inch tile. You're going to want some knee pads. Believe me, when you start working on that tile, it's pretty hard on the knees. And you're going to need, for the thinset, in this case, a trowel with a 3/8 notch in it. That's what's required for a tile of that size, and to clean mud out around tiles periodically to check lines and so forth. You're going to want just a good old plain old-fashioned pointed trowel. I use a square just to confirm that when I'm doing the layout, my tiles are squared up. And I will also check that with a tape measure, but that helps as a quick aid to make sure you're square. Of course, tape measure, chalk line. I happen to have a laser to shoot a line down a tile to see if it's still staying in line. But as you're going, sometimes you can just use a level, lay the level on top to make sure you're not rocking, that you're staying flat, because there's some variation in a concrete floor like this. When I put the thinset down, the tile on top, sometimes you can get the tiles not completely flat. So that helps you check that, and you can also lay this along the side of the tile periodically to find out if a section is still staying in line, because you want to keep the square all the way through the project, and you're going to have to keep checking it. Something else that's very important to note before you start tiling is that you need to give your tile time to acclimate to the temperature in the room that you're going to be putting it in. This tile was brought in several days ahead of the project, went and picked it up, and it was in the winter, so the temperatures were pretty cold. It's been sitting here on the floor in the basement where it's going to be used, and it is completely acclimated to the conditions down here, to the humidity and to the temperature. So now when I start putting the tile down with the thinset, I'm not going to be having condensation problems and other issues. Now that's something to bear in mind, so don't just rush out in the winter or the summer, buy your tile and start putting it down. Give it a couple of days to get used to being in the room where it's going to be used. Whatever substrate you're using, you want to make sure it's sealed. There are different barrier materials you can get. For instance, if you're putting tile over a plywood subfloor, you want to either get that sealed really well, which is something I always did with a high quality sealing paint, or maybe you want to put down some of the membrane they have available over the top first so you don't pull the moisture out of the thinset into the plywood. And even though I'm laying this on concrete, this concrete has all been painted with a waterproofing paint for concrete. And that will keep the moisture from pulling down out of the thinset when you set the tile, and it'll allow it to cure properly. Something else to note with these tile before we start laying them is that most tile has some sort of a direction stamp on it. Because of the pattern on the tile, you want to make sure that you lay them consistently, particularly if there's a very strong pattern in the tile. Now these are a random pattern tile, but they still have an arrow mark on each tile. So you want to run your tile always with that arrow facing the same direction. Otherwise you can become inconsistent in spots and it just won't look right to the eye. I have some other tile that I've laid where that's very important to keep that orientation. And even if I didn't have that mark, just to be on the safe side, each of these tile has a stamp mark on it, made in the USA over here, and it's got a flag in this corner. So I would just go by that and always put that flag in the same corner as I'm laying the tile. In a previous video, we did some test layout work to make sure that everything was going to line up when we put this tile down to give us a good starting point in the main room where we are going to begin our tile work. As you recall, we started here, we did a rough layout. That gave me a pretty good feel for where everything was going to end up. And that's really all you need to estimate your tile and roughly where it's going to lay. And that gave me a starting point for the tile on this end. Notice that I've got a mark on this wall, and then I used the laser along here from the other room and checked it and made sure as I went along the tile it hit this mark over here to know that I'm perfectly straight here. Then I line these tile up with the mark here to make sure they're perfectly centered. I centered that tile up on here and made a mark on the outside where I'm going to do the chalk line for the outer edge of where these tiles have to be laid as I'm laying the floor. There's a mark there, and then a mark down here to use to drop that chalk line. And then I verified that I'm square here on this tile layout, made my 3-foot and 4-foot marks and measured across, so I am square. My wife and I dropped the new chalk lines, one the full length of the room and the one that goes across the room for the starting point. And I have used the 3-4 rule and measured across, and I am square on the corner. I'm going to get this one glued down with the thinset, and when I get to the end, then I'm going to start working a row across the room and bring that whole group of tile up to this end. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do the same thing, start with this back row and bring it out to the end where I can come out the door. It's time to start mixing some thinset and start putting some tile down. The area where I'm going to start, I swept that again to make sure it was clean, because if you are laying the tile over a film of dust, well, it's going to stick to the dust and not stick to the floors. In order to make this simple going forward, I set up some measuring tools here. This is a 50-pound bag of thinset. The directions call for anywhere from 6 to 7.5 quarts of water for that 50-pound bag. Well, I'm not going to deal with 50 pounds at a crack. I'd have to move pretty fast. I'm going to mix a much smaller quantity. I'm going to start out with a quarter bag. That's 12.5 pounds. I'm going to stick to the lower end of the water too, because this basement is just a little bit on the humid side most of the time. And since the substrate here is all sealed, it won't be pulling moisture. So I'm going to go on the lower end. And so for that quarter bag of thinset, I'm going to start out with 1.5 quarts of water. So I marked a line on this ice cream bucket where 1.5 quarts of water is. So when it comes time to mix more, I just fill it up to that line. And I marked inside this bucket the line where 12.5 pounds of the thinset comes to, the dry thinset. So when it comes time again to mix up another batch, I pour some out of the bag into here till I get to that mark, and I've got 12.5 pounds. If I get really courageous and want to go to a half a bag at a time, well, obviously I would double both of these. So the water goes into this bucket first. I've already got some in there. I'm going to mix this outside. Whenever you're weighing up and measuring, you always want to have that respirator on, because this stuff is not good for your lungs and it's very fine powder. So, and do as little of this inside the house as possible. It's a little bit warmer today. It's in the upper 50s outside, so I'm going to go outside and do the actual mixing, because I will make some dust. Bring it in and then we will get started. Okay, that's been mixed for a couple of minutes. Needs to sit now for 10 minutes and then it'll be ready to use. It's nice to have weather where you can do this sort of thing right outside the house, have a hose ready. Because what I like to do in between batches, so this stuff doesn't stick, is wash the end of this thing off. Save you a lot of trouble in the long run. All right, I have the timer running on my watch, and in a few minutes we'll be ready to start putting this down on the floor. Although for the final tiling job, I am laying a row of tile from the front of the room to the back towards the fireplace, and then laying the tile across the back. For demonstration purposes, I laid a small section of tile right in front of the fireplace to show you exactly how to apply the thin set and get the tile started. Along these lines, I'm going to start in this corner right here. This line is critical and this line is critical. Get the tile started along there, and then I will work my way that direction. And I have some tile laid out, ready to go in the proper orientation. This Made in USA mark is going to go that direction. The little arrow is pointing to the north, which is behind my back, and I have these oriented already before I get started, so I don't have to fumble with that. Set out on the floor. I've got my spacers ready. I've got my trowel ready to score along those lines so I can keep an eye on where that line is so I can keep this tile where it's supposed to be. And I've also got my level close by to line up along the edge and across the top to make sure that I am sitting straight. I made sure that anything I was going to need for the rest of this process is not sitting here, because once I start setting this tile, I want it to sit for at least a day before I walk on it. So if this stuff is over here and I need it, that's a bit of a problem. So let's pick up a little bit of this thin set here. It's just a little bit on the wet side, I think, even with holding back on the water. And notice I'm not putting it up next to the brick of the fireplace yet, and the reason being, I'm going to come back later and do those edge tiles, and we will do a separate video on how to mark and cut the edge tiles. First thing you want to do is get a good, solid, secure starting point with the straight, uncut tiles. Well, that's what I'm doing now, getting a good coat of mud down here along that line, and then you strike in one direction, holding your trowel at a consistent angle so you get a decent depth. And the reason you want to go one direction is it allows the air to escape as you're setting the tiles down. So let me grab a tile, get a little more grout on this end. In that corner, I've always been calling this ceramic tile, and it is in fact a porcelain tile. Porcelain tile is just a little bit denser, less likely to absorb moisture than a pure ceramic tile. That's probably the main difference from my perspective. And in a basement like this where you still may have some moisture in the floor, I kind of like the idea of the harder tile compound. So I'm going to set this tile in place along that line. I'm going to take my trowel here, move some of that cement away so I can see that line, because I have to be very precise on that. Get this turned in place there, turn in place here, press it down, work it down into the floor. You don't want to squeeze everything out. Obviously you want to have some thin set down there to hold the tile. I'm going to drag this away on the edge. All the edges, so I've got a good clean flat surface later when I come to put in the other tiles and the tile along the fireplace. All right, I am on that line where I need to be. I'm going to grab my second tile. Another reason you take this cement out of here is that it keeps it from pushing up into where the grout's going to go. It makes it a little bit easier. Get this lined up here. Pressed in place. Check my mark here. Now I need tile spacer. Give myself the gap that I need. Now you want to be careful using the trowel in between those tiles. You don't want to chip them. So be very gentle while you're doing that. I've used these particular tile spacers over and over on every tile job I've done in this house and a couple other locations. Just wash them up when you're done, and they're ready to go for the next job. We have 3 tiles down. I am going to check them across now, make sure they're flat with the level here. I don't really feel any rocking here. I know I'm going to have some dips and swales because this floor, as I said, is not perfect, but it's not far enough out to warrant pouring a bunch of leveler in here. So that looks pretty good. Lay my level along here. Get this off so I don't mess the level up. And I am in line where I need to be. This is a critical point right here. You have to make sure when you get started right here that you've got everything where it needs to be. I'm checking the level out along on this end of the line and this end of the line. And along the side, we are lined up. Spacers will stay in till this is dry. I'm going to come back in a little bit with my grouting sponge and just wipe off the tiles lightly to get any residue from the thinset off while it's still not firmly set. That makes it a little bit easier to get off and makes it cleaner when you come back to grout. That'll be it for this video, getting this part done. In the next video, we're going to mark and cut the edge tiles, and then we'll start getting those put in place. So if you've enjoyed today's video, please click like and consider subscribing to our channel. Until next time, enjoy your projects and take care.